also thanking Dockfield and Art Santa Monica for having this event, because this is an incredibly timely and important subject, and I'm thrilled to be here on the same platform with Tomas van Houtryve. I thought I would set the stage for his presentation by giving a short overview about the drone war in which the US is engaged, and then by speaking briefly about the use of drones for surveillance and what this has to do with people here in Spain and Europe as a whole. Let me start by quoting Noam Chomsky, who I'm sure many of you know about. He said recently that, quote, "The US is conducting the most extraordinary global association terror campaign in world history. It is the drone campaign, which is officially described as a campaign intended to kill people who are suspected of maybe someday planning to harm us." The global assassination campaign has been carried out in secret by the Central Intelligence Agency and US military special forces, not just in the declared war zones of Afghanistan and Iraq, but in many other countries which are outside US declared war zones, including Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Libya. The list may be longer and is bound to expand in the years ahead, since the US is making the entire world its battlefield in its forever war. How many people have been targeted for death by drone? We don't know for sure. There are two different kill lists, one compiled by the CIA and the other by the Pentagon's Special Joint Operations Unit, with the president signing off on those names that should be included. What we do know is that very many of those who have been killed in drone strikes, and the number could be as high as 4,700 such deaths in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia alone. But we know that most, or certainly many, of the names of those killed are unknown. They never appeared on either list, and I'll leave it to Tomas to say why that is the case. Hundreds of them are children. The United States has a president who reportedly told his aides that, quote, "It turns out I'm really good at killing people." This was in the New York Times. Indeed, there have been 9 times as many drone strikes under President Obama as under President Bush. The results of these strikes show that rarely do the right people, and I say right people in quotes, get killed. In fact, the UK human rights group Reprieve found that attempts to kill 41 men who were on the kill lists resulted in the obliteration from the skies of 1,147 people. As far as we know, 10 Americans have been killed in drone strikes, only one of whom was deliberately targeted for death. 15 Europeans have been killed and 4 Australians, and we have no way of knowing whether their home countries were consulted before they were incinerated. Has the killer drone program been effective? I think a tweet from a lawyer in Yemen sums it up. He said, quote, "Dear Obama, when a US drone missile kills a child in Yemen, the father will go to war with you, guaranteed. Nothing to do with Al-Qaeda." Even though there is plenty of evidence that the civilian death toll is making killer drones counterproductive, 2/3 of Americans support them. Contrast that with a June 2002 poll, which showed that here in Spain, 76% of people opposed drone strikes and only 21% supported them. So far, to our knowledge, Spain has not been involved in the US drone war, although other European countries have. Both Germany and the UK have reportedly been involved in the transmission of data between drone operators in the American West and targeted countries. A legal action now threatens the ongoing use of the US Ramstein Air Base in Germany for this purpose. I wonder what, if anything, this could mean for the Morón de la Frontera Air Base near Seville. As you may know, a deal signed in June, a few months ago, or just last month, gives the US expanded use of the base, which is now going to be the center for US AFRICOM and air operations in Africa. And incidentally, the Air Force unit stationed at that base is under the direct command of Ramstein, the air base in Germany. You should know that the European Union industries and defense contractors are using public funds to develop and promote drones, including for military purposes. And an important report by Statewatch called Eurodrones reveals that over the last decade, some 500 million euros have been spent on research and development for both surveillance and military drone systems. We can perhaps talk in the discussion period about what actions we can take to prevent the swiftly expanding drone industry from destroying privacy and turning countries into surveillance states. Now, to date, at least 50 countries, and one source says the number might be 80, as high as 80, have obtained their own drones for a variety of purposes. But I know of no single country that has finalized regulations for their use that respect privacy rights. Spain now uses a small reconnaissance drones and is considering bids from Israel and the United States for a 300 million euro project to provide it with a fleet of drones permitting 24-hour long range surveillance. The Blue Sky Days exhibit, which I think you'll be seeing after this presentation, focuses on drone warfare and the use of drones for surveillance. But of course, the drone technology has many other actual and potential uses, some of which we have to commend. I mean, they are, a great step forward in some respects. Last April, Spain's state agency for aerial safety banned all civilian drone use for any commercial purpose, but after a public outcry, soon backed away from a blanket ban. The government subsequently approved a provisional framework for their use, but to my knowledge, full legislation governing their use is still pending. So for many reasons, tonight's event is very timely. Before regulations have been finalized, when everything is still up in the air, so to speak, you can have a say shaping the public debate about how drones should be used in Spain and in the European Union. So I want to now personally thank Tomas van Houtryve for demonstrating the role that photography can play in getting people to think about the US drone wars, and for forcing us to ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to build? Thank you.
Gracias.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Jessica, Elena, and Artes Santa Monica for hosting this issue and this exhibition. I want to talk a little bit about how I decided to approach this project and what pulled me into it. So one interesting thing to look at is how people see images today. And I put in a search on Google image search for the Vietnam War, and this is what comes up. So actually, if you look up here on the first page, there's a pretty good visual record of what the war in Vietnam looks like. You have a famous picture of an assassination in Saigon by Eddie Adams over here on the right. You have Kim Phuc. This is the girl who's running from a napalm attack. You have soldiers in the mud. You have war protesters on the top. So back in the 60s and 70s, this is the visual record that the media was capable of producing when there was a major US war. if you put in drone war, so you'll notice that the kind of images we see is almost, if you were a drone manufacturer and you wanted to make a catalog to sell drones, this might be the kind of images you would put on the internet. So as a long-time photojournalist, I've been doing photography for over 15 years, first as a press photographer, and covering some US conflicts. I found it troubling that our visual record is so weak, and especially at this time. We're living in a time of history where it is easier than ever to connect, to send pictures around the world. We're in the most media-connected age ever, and yet this is the visual record we have of the number one US foreign policy abroad at the moment. And what some of the photographers have done in previous wars is not just document what's happening, but also bring the feeling of the war home to the population, especially in democracies, who vote in their politicians, who can decide if they want violence to be carried out in their name abroad. So, as Nancy said, there may not be a lot of photographs, but there is information about the drone war. It doesn't appear that often in the mainstream press, but there are a lot of human rights organizations and local journalists who are collecting information on these strikes. So I started looking at these human rights reports and investigative journalism reports and finding this kind of thing. So what I decided to do is take these strike reports, get as many detailed ones as I could, and some of the strike reports have quite detailed situations that explain about what it was like. And the first thing that shocked me is when you read the strike reports, it doesn't sound like a battlefield. It's not soldiers running across a field that are being hit by drones. It's often a strike that will happen in a schoolyard, or a strike that will happen in a marketplace, or a hit on a civilian house in a residential neighborhood. And some of the strikes, like the one listed up here, are absolutely horrifying, like a strike on a wedding. So you can imagine hundreds of people gathering together, celebrating love and bringing together two families, and then out of the sky, a missile is fired and just erases people. So we don't know exactly how these strikes happen because the war is classified and is run by the CIA. They don't make explanations or excuses when there's a strike on a wedding like this, but we can guess a little bit. We know that they collect information in different ways. They follow people's mobile phones around, and so perhaps if a suspect carrying a mobile phone or several of them go to a wedding, the people watching from the United States say, it's not a wedding, it's terrorists grouping together, and then they fire with the drone. So my response to this was to buy a very small civilian drone and modify it and go to the United States and look for the exact kind of situations that showed up in these strike reports. Situations like weddings. And then I would go and fly my drone over those situations and take pictures. Well, here's another report that I came across about a religious school that was hit and 69 Pakistani children were killed. And so this is a schoolyard that I photographed in the United States at a high school. Equally as horrifying to me as the strikes on weddings, there have also been strikes on funerals. And some investigative journalists have tried to piece together how this happened. From what I can understand from reading about this one is that the United States wanted to kill a very high-level Taliban commander, and they couldn't manage to get that person under surveillance. So what they did is they purposely killed one of his subordinates, one of his lower-level lieutenants. When that person was killed, they had to have a funeral for him. All the people in the village and relatives came out for the funeral, and they hoped that the commander would also come out to the funeral and then strike on it. They did. They hit the funeral. They killed 60 mourners that were there, but the actual prime suspect got away. 3 months later, they were able to put him under surveillance, and they fired a missile on him when he was at his father-in-law's house with his wife. So this is a cemetery in the United States with U.S. Marines doing a wreath-laying ceremony. So that last example of the funeral explains a little bit why when Nancy talked about the statistics, there have been so many people, upwards of 4,000, we think, we don't know the exact numbers, that have been killed by drones. but very few high-value targets. That's the words that the US uses when they want to kill a Taliban commander or a known figure inside Al-Qaeda. They call them high-value targets. They put them on the kill list that Nancy was talking about. But just for this one example, 60 people died, and they didn't even get the high-value target. Another thing that we know is that when the United States is counting casualties, anytime a military-age male is killed in these areas of Pakistan or Yemen, they are counted as a combatant, whether they know what their activities are or not. So what we know is that there are less than 100 high-value targets who have been killed, thousands of people that have been classified as the United States as combatants just because that they were male and living in certain geographical areas, and hundreds of children that have been killed. Yet, to the American public and also military planners around the world who want to use drones have sold the public the idea that drones are this incredibly precise weapon. They use the term surgical strikes that you do with drones as if somehow magically the drone kills terrorism suspects and nobody else. The figures, the numbers of casualties that you see makes the drone look more like any other kind of airstrikes or traditional military weapons. Doing the research, there's something else troubling that I came across that human rights groups are very upset about, and that's something called a double tap strike. Drones can stay in the air much longer than traditional aircraft, so the drone pilots will fire on the suspect, and then the drone will stay in the air and wait and see what happened afterwards. And what's been recorded by investigators is that in several cases, a car or a house was fired on by a drone, and when the car caught on fire, nearby people would run out and try to pull the people from the car and save them, or pull people from the house and save them. And the drone would strike again, firing on the people that tried to help the people that were hit the first time. They call these double tap strikes. Now, the reason human rights groups are so upset about this is somebody who is helping and pulling somebody from a burning car is not the same thing as a terrorism suspect or a high-value target. The other terminology I came across when I was researching this is something called signature strikes. So not only does the United States have this kill list of people that they want to assassinate by drone, but they've decided that there's certain kinds of behavior that is suspect. And if somebody's doing that kind of behavior, that is enough to merit a drone strike on them. And even within the US government, there is debate about this and some tension about this. I read an article in the New York Times where an official from the Department of State, which is like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was criticizing the CIA. And the quote was, for the CIA, 3 people doing jumping jacks would be evidence of a terrorist training camp. So here's some signature behavior in Philadelphia. As Nancy mentioned, there's also one US citizen who has been put on the kill list in addition to 9 others that have been killed without even being targeted. And that's a guy named Anwar al-Awlaki. He was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, grew up with a normal family. His father was a university teacher, and he became radicalized, moved to Yemen, and started putting out a propaganda magazine for Al-Qaeda. So Obama put his name on the list, and a drone was used in Yemen to successfully assassinate him. So to talk about him, I found the birth records for Anwar al-Awlaki, and this is the house where he was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. What's interesting about this is that there was no public debate. The executive branch of the United States decided in secret that not only could they kill who they wanted outside of declared war zones with a drone, that would also include U.S. citizens. For the U.S. government to kill somebody in the United States, there's a lot of different steps they have to go through legally. It's a country that still has the death penalty, unlike most European countries, but even then it's quite difficult. But here's Obama making a decision without any external review or transparency and being able to kill U.S. citizens anywhere in the world. So it makes me think, when I think about this signature behavior and people being targeted outside of war zones all around the world, what is it like to be judged only by your mobile phone data and being seen from thousands of meters up in the air. If the only thing that somebody knew about me is the activities they saw me with, or the cell phones of the people that were next to me, should that be sufficient evidence of whether I should be killed or not? So one of the pictures that I took to try to evoke the ambiguity of surveillance from the air is this one. And it's actually people just doing yoga in a park in San Francisco. Many times when I show it to people, they think it's people doing Muslim-style prayer. So at the beginning of this project, when I first researched it, I was quite worried about what the US was doing abroad with the drones, how they were being used in Pakistan. And I said, what if one day they start using them in the same way in the United States, or they start using them more and more in the United States? And in the middle of the project, there was a lawsuit from this organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, to get a record of all of the drone flights that had been authorized by government entities in the United States. And in fact, drones have been used for years now in the United States for policing and for surveillance of the citizens without it ever being announced to the public or without there being a debate. So as a second part of the project, I started going to some of these red dots on the map, putting my little drone in the air and taking pictures of those areas to question what could the government see with their drones of the people. So this is in Gaithersburg, Maryland, a site that the government allowed 2 government entities to fly drones. This is on the US-Mexican border, where the United States has a fleet of 12 Predator drones. Predators are the exact same aircraft that are used over Afghanistan, over Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. And initially, this was announced publicly, and it was said they were just to verify border threats, to do surveillance on the border. There was another lawsuit that came out, and it was revealed that between 2012 and 2014, those drones were lent out more than 700 times to different government entities, including the FBI, the DEA, local sheriff's departments. And the other thing is, publicly, the Department of Border Protection said they would never arm these drones, but records were found where they had tried to purchase non-lethal arms for these drones, like tear gas canisters and things to immobilize people. So there's a slow militarization of these tools, even over civilian airspace. And this kind of thinking, this slippery slope between tools of war and using it for other purposes, is something that we find in military planners around the world. A few months ago, one of the Italian defense minister made a suggestion that drones should be used to do strikes on empty migrant boats in Libya on the other side of the Mediterranean to destroy them before they could be used by migrants. So the drone is sort of seen as this tool that you can use in any circumstance because you're not risking a pilot's life in the air. It's easy to do. The United States has gotten away with it for years. Another area that I photographed in the United States is this prison. It's called Tent City Prison. It's run by a sheriff in Phoenix, Arizona. And he's a huge fan of taking military things and using them for police work. So these are old US Army tents. He's also added watchtowers, stun fences, and facial recognition to this prison. And he announced in the press that he wanted to add drones to it also. So I went there and asked them if I could fly my drone over it, and they were actually surprisingly enthusiastic, and then were asking advice of whether I could put an infrared camera on it and things like that. So what this raises the question for me is, what kind of society do we want to live in? This is a picture of a panopticon prison, and that's the image that comes to mind to me. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, came up with the idea of the panopticon, and it was further developed by Michel Foucault, which is this idea that you could have a perfect surveillance system. You wouldn't need to watch people at all times. It was originally built for prisons, but just that the detainees in the prison would always feel watched, whether they were being watched or not, and that would be enough to change their behavior. And putting a drone in the air is the equivalent of putting up a watchtower, but you don't see it. Slowly, the United States and other countries are being covered by little watchtowers in the air. Are we going to start changing our behavior because of this? And as Nancy said, the laws on this are being written right now. Right now, the technology is arriving. It's being used. It's ahead of the laws and the regulations. And we can move to the discussion section if you want.
I know there must be many questions here, but I'd like to start with two and then open up, because these are two things which I know Tomas will have a lot to say about, and he hadn't the time to bring them into his presentation. One is, where did the title Blue Sky Days come from? And the second one is, could you say something about autonomous drones?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of visibility for drone strike victims, but there was a case where there was a family that was struck by a drone in Pakistan. It was actually the grandmother who was out in a field picking vegetables, and her grandkids were watching, and she was struck. And we don't know why she was killed by this drone, what the mistake was, or if she was purposely targeted. But some lawyers in Pakistan managed to bring her grandchildren to the United States and testify in front of a few congressmen. And one of the things that the grandson said really struck with me. He said the drones are constantly present in Pakistan, and that he doesn't like blue skies anymore because the drones are always in the sky. It's only on gray sky days when there's less visibility when they get a little break from them, basically. And for me, the idea that the sky has always been a, sort of this neutral or beautiful thing, or maybe if you're scared of anything, it might be some hail or a lightning strike. We shouldn't be permanently terrified of the sky, and yet that's what this technology is bringing. And then the other question was about artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, which is computers and algorithms making autonomous decision, is slowly being integrated into drone technology, or perhaps quickly behind the scenes, and we're slowly learning about it. So the next generation of drones will not need a controller, a human being controller down on the ground, flying it or deciding when to kill. The drone will be given a mission, and it will know by itself, self-aware, know where it is, when to strike. It can have sensors where it can recognize faces or patterns of how people walk or certain kinds of behavior, and autonomously decide when to fire its missiles or not. That's the way not just drones, but all war systems are going, that the computers will make the decisions of when people should live or die or not.
Okay, I'd now like to open it up. So let's have some questions from the audience. You've heard this rich description of what's happening. Is this something you all knew about? Did you ever read about it in the Spanish press? Or was, was this pretty much new information?
Yo en la española personalmente no, y sigo un poco las cuestiones y no.
I haven't read anything in the Spanish press.
Okay, so this is new. So what are you going to do about it? Well, that's a really important question, and I'd like to ask Tomas what he thinks, and then I could add a few words.
I mean, I'm on the side of this as an artist. I don't have the activism background or the legal background. The thing is that's good, though, is that the laws are not already written. The technology is arriving very, very fast, but governments haven't decided exactly what the boundaries are to this technology. So this is an important time to talk about it, to lobby about it, to do artistic projects about it, and tell you what you think. I mean, do you want to live in a world where your country can send flying robots that autonomously decide when to kill people or not? Do you want your sky to be filled with watchtowers looking down on you, recording information that will be kept by the government, and for how long? These things have to be decided. So probably Nancy has more details of how you could get involved in legal or activism to try to have an impact on lawmaking. Just to follow up on that, the other question is, should this technology be only in the hands of security forces, or is this something that civilians should be allowed to use, like me with my little drone? This isn't the first world-changing technology that's arrived, but imagine, for example, when the printing press was invented, or the television was invented, or the pen was invented, if only government security forces could use it and nobody else had access to control over it. This is something we might want to think about with drones too. Should it be something that people in a pluralist democracy can use, or only in the hands of the government?
currently illegal? Like, how did you?
Well, they tried to ban civilian drones completely in Spain, and there was a pushback. In the United States, they're writing the laws right now, so they haven't made a final judgment on it.
How did you get your?
Because it's still open. It's still the
Right.
Wild West until they make the laws.
Right. And in Spain, this is now being debated. After the pushback, they did come up with some regulations based on the weight of the drone for how commercial drones can be used. Military is really off the table as far as public discussion. And I would say that the number one thing one needs to do is put military drones on the table and really create a sense in Spain, number one, that you do not want Spain participating in drone wars. You don't want militarized drones. And I think that is something now that public debate can happen around, and projects like Tomas's can help inform the public about why this is important. And then the second thing I would say that can happen right now is for, as you educate yourself about what the EU is doing. We all know the EU is not very democratic. I don't think this is a controversial statement. But it really needs to be pushed on this issue to be much more transparent. In Britain, Parliament has established a watch group, a parliamentary watch group, to ask questions, at least to air the issue. What is being planned? All these, well, €500 million to date going into R&D for drones. For what purpose? So there has to be light shed on what is happening with what is called Euro drones. And I don't know how many of you can read the English version of this report put out by State Watch, which is called Euro drones. But it would be a very important starting point to see what is happening. Now, one of the uses to which the drones will be put, unless there is much more public outcry, was mentioned by Tomas, to patrol borders. Many of the exhibits at this Dockfield Festival have featured the issue of migration and the tragedy that people, have hundreds of people, thousands of people died trying to cross borders. This issue of putting drones in the hands of Frontex, the European-wide monitor of borders, is something I think which people can intercede on, because what that means is that you are saying that migrants are not being seen as individuals, but they're being seen from the sky just as threats. They're not being seen as individuals with human rights and the right to asylum. So these are the kinds of things which now are in the works, and I think just focusing attention on it can really help change the situation. So people will realize what has been missing is empathy. And I'm going to let Carol translate that, but I then want to turn back to Tomas and say, would you say something about empathy and the use of drones, how that influenced your thinking?
Well, speaking of empathy, just as a photographer, most of my career I've been with my feet on the ground, and when I photograph people, I have to meet them, I have to talk to them, I have to convince them, they have to like me somewhat, otherwise they'll throw me out, and that'll be the end of my access. Through the drone, I can just use the screen. Often I can be standing 200 meters or more away. For US military pilots, they can be sitting 2,000 or 8,000 kilometers away. And I can get the photo without any human contact whatsoever, and interacting purely through my screen. And I felt already there was, the only thing that was holding me back was myself. If I wanted to spy on people or take the kind of pictures that they wouldn't like, it wasn't them or the technology that would stop me. It'd be only my own internal ethics or morals that would stop me from doing that. And I feel that's an analogy for how war is being done, that having soldiers that never risk their lives, that don't know even what it's like to be in combat or to feel under risk, putting other people's lives at risk through screens. They never see real people. They never hear the screams of the children that have been blown up by these bombs. There's all these barriers that are being put between human beings, and it actually breaks down empathy and makes war easier to carry out.
Muchas gracias a las dos. Mi pregunta es referente en realidad a esos 9 US citizens, ¿no? 9 creo que habéis dicho que han sido asesinados con drones, y en realidad es en referencia a su fenotipo. O sea, a mí me gustaría saber, igual que Al-Awlaki no era una persona no blanca, el resto de esos 9, ¿qué proporción hay entre gente blanca y gente no blanca, como sería el caso de Al-Awlaki? Porque creo que hay un problema en el norte global con la cuestión de la vigilancia, que el blanco cree que es una cosa de musulmanes, ¿de acuerdo? Es una cosa que no le va a afectar a él, sino que solo le afecta pues básicamente a musulmanes, ¿no? Entonces, por un dato así curioso que me gustaría saber respecto a esos 9 US citizens que se decide asesinar sin due process, sin ningún tipo de proceso legal, ¿no?
Should I?
I
can
think
answer
you know
that.
more about these 9.
Yeah. Well, all but one, I believe, were Muslim. The one was this aid worker, an elderly man, who recently was killed by a drone strike on a house. Now, when the U.S. says its strikes are surgical, it has total information, it never blunders. This was a major blunder. He was not the only one killed. He was well, you call him white, elderly, I think, Jewish man. The other person who was killed was an Italian who was also in the house at the time. And apparently their whereabouts was not known. So of the others, one was the 16-year-old son of Anwar al-Awlaki. He was killed when a drone strike vaporized an outdoor restaurant where he had been eating with his cousins. The others were in places where they shouldn't have been, in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it has been used, in the so-called war on terror, but who knows where it will be used, where these weapons will be used next. We do know that the United States is not the only one that's used drones to kill. Israel has used drones to kill. We also know that it's very likely soon that we will have dozens and dozens of countries that can use drones to kill. There is a website that keeps track of the military-industrial complex called Defense One, and it says that within 10 years, practically every country in the world will have armed drones. So it's only the beginning unless we can stop it.
Quería hacer dos comentarios para los dos. 2 comments on what you put on the screen. It seems quite an irony that White House Press Association gives you a prize. And the second comment is something that I heard Trevor Paglen comment about the issues you are discussing now. And he was saying that we are passing from a visual regime that it was mainly representational, from representation, towards a new one that is operational. It's only to make operations, but mainly the big part of images that they will be made, it will be not for representing something for an audience, but just to use made and into for a machine from another for another machine. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's ironic and very surprising that the White House Press Photographers Association gave it this prize. Just how that happened is, if you go in the exhibition space, there's a video in the background, a multimedia video, and that was edited by an editor at National Geographic magazine. And National Geographic is a member of this press association because they're based in Washington, and they sent it in for a prize, and amazingly, it won it. Actually, if I'd gone to the award ceremony, I could have met Obama, but I wasn't free at the time. Hopefully, some of this will sink in to him, or it'll become people in Washington that can make decisions will see it because of the award. I think what you said about Trevor Paglen is very important, and it's something that's really bothered me as a photographer. Is if anybody here is a photographer, if you've studied the history of photography, if you go to school, they'll teach you about portraiture. They'll teach you about how photography is used for journalism, how we use it day to day to capture memories and things like that. But if you think of cameras right now, how many are in the hands of artists, civilians, photographers? And how many cameras are solely attached to machines which are using photographs for targeting, spying, killing, surveillance? Somehow we're at a point in the history of photography where it's slowly becoming weaponized, where more and more cameras are used not to make images that are pleasing, beautiful, interesting to the human eye, but just to capture data that will be later used to monitor behavior or to kill people. It's machine vision, where the drone is using the camera for it to see for itself, for its own algorithms to decide whether it should strike or not.
Una cosa que me pregunto es, cuando atacan a países tipo Pakistán, Yemen, ¿es en connivencia de los gobiernos o no sería un acto de guerra? Porque están atacando a sus propios ciudadanos. Y otro es cuando hay víctimas así colaterales o víctimas por error, son tratadas como víctimas de guerra. ¿Hay alguna compensación o se pone en contacto con ellos los gobiernos? Algo. Gracias.
Well, there are two different responses. In Pakistan, the High Court and the government have said these strikes in the tribal administrative zones are illegal and must stop. Yet the strikes go on. There is probably some ambiguity there. It could be they're saying this for public purposes and don't really mean it, but they have said the strikes have to stop. Yemen, the now deposed president of Yemen was a big fan of these strikes. In fact, he said the U.S. strikes, well, he doesn't say they're always U.S., he says they're Yemeni strikes, but the U.S. is helping. They always get the right people, he said. He is now no longer the president. Now Yemen is in total chaos, and millions have been displaced and are suffering because of it. As far as any kind of compensation, no. The U.S. won't even acknowledge who is being killed. So there is absolutely no chance of those families bringing attempts to get any kind of compensation. I mentioned earlier there was a lawsuit in Germany trying to stop the use of Ramstein Air Base, the satellite relay station, which was sending information back and forth. That was brought by a Yemeni family member of someone killed in a strike, and that suit is going ahead. But generally, no, there's absolutely no way for families to get any kind of justice.